So let me just blow this up a little bit. There is a questionnaire that Fabian and you folks are putting together, which is going to give you a way to go through a series of questions with a particular small and medium-sized enterprise to give them sort of a report card or a health check on how they're doing on these things. One of the sources that is contributing to some of the ideas in those questions is the tool that I'm going to go through with you today. And the tool by itself may be useful at some point for you as well. So you'll have choices as to whether you use the one that Fabian is putting together and or this one. And there are others as well, but I thought this one might be of use to some of you. So in terms of what we're going to be doing today, I'll do a quick review of what we covered last time and get into what the core issues around sustainability are that we would like to understand better, that companies are paying attention to, and then get into the toolkit. So just as a quick review, there's a process here, your ABCD process that you're looking at. And the tool that we talked about last time, how to get a rough idea as to how much better the company will perform on its bottom line if it were to embrace a whole bunch of sustainability kinds of initiatives. If it became a truly sustainable enterprise, how good would that be? So the awareness part of your effort would be to awaken them to possibilities. And this helps you put some numbers around what those possibilities might be. The baseline assessment part is kind of assessing where they are today. Sorry, let me go back up. Where they are today, and that's what we're going to be talking about as well today. And then decide on priorities. D is something that we're going to be talking about next time as to how they make a decision, a business decision as to whether they're going to undertake a project or not, and what's in it for them if they were to do that. So we'll come back to that. Last time we also talked about how to frame sustainability, the three aspects: environmental, social, and governance, or environmental, social, and economy, or environmental, social, and business, but it starts with the environment. So the nested interdependencies model shows the environment in which society is nested and business is nested in society. And the punchline of that is that society and business are wholly owned subsidiaries of the environment, totally dependent on the health of the environment for our continued existence and well-being. We talked about the way in which businesses are impacting society and the environment, and the fact that some of those impacts are starting to boomerang back onto business these days. So what's happening is we're interfering with the services that are provided to us by the environment. So let's spend a little time on, or a couple more minutes on the environment. There are services that are provided that are called ecosystem services, and there are about 20 of them. They're normally divided into 4 groups. So what this says is that the environment for free, just automatically, has been providing us with these services forever. Provisioning services, that's where we get our food and our materials from and our water from. Regulating services, climate regulation, water regulation, pollination, erosion regulation. So a whole bunch of things that keep things in balance appropriately. Supporting services like photosynthesis. And then these other ones that are called cultural, the value that we get from a recreation and ecotourism perspective, the enjoyment that we get from nature, and in many cases, the deeper enjoyment that we get, the spiritual and religious connection to nature. So all of those things have been going on forever, and all of them, or the majority of them, at least 60 to 70% of them, are in stress these days. And of course, the one that gets most attention is climate, but there are others as well, biodiversity, etc. So that's why we need to be more careful about the way in which we treat those services and the environment that provides them, and hopefully restore some of those services back. There are different ways of showing the fact that we are starting to put some pressure on our so-called planetary boundaries. This is a diagram that some of you may be familiar with. It was initially done by Johann Rockström, where he talked about planetary boundaries, which are the ones around the outside. And the red indicates that we are exceeding the planetary boundaries associated with each of those particular areas: climate change, biodiversity, etc., land conversion. And then there's this thing called a social donut that Kate Raworth put together, where she shows that we have a need for water and food and health and education, all of these kinds of things, and that we are actually shortfalling a number of those in human society on the planet. So we have this donut for healthy living, where we are bounded by the planetary boundaries and the social, the way in which we are dependent on these factors for our well-being. And then there's the white paper that I published a couple of months ago, which shows that we're in a crisis mode on these issues, on the nests, and that we need to take more bold strokes to be able to address those at a global level. So that's a little bit of the background that we talked about. Talks about the overall benefit of the company doing more on all of these things. And today we're going to be talking about the 3-in-1 Sustainability Assessment Toolkit, which is a way of making an assessment of the extent to which the company is contributing to the well-being or lack of it of the nests, the social and environmental nests. Any questions about any of that? Just to kind of set the stage.
Everything's so clear. Thank you.
Okay. So why do we care about this? We need business to help us. Guys, the big corporations, the big multinationals, and they have huge, huge leverage on what we all do and what happens to small and medium-sized enterprises, especially in their supply chains. But we also have to acknowledge that we need to engage small and medium-sized enterprises in all of this. And they definitely make up most of the companies in Canada. 98.6% of them have 200 employees or less. 99.8% of them have 500 employees or less. So by far the majority of companies in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's true for all jurisdictions in the world. So we need to be able to help them be more responsible and give them tools that help them assess how they're doing on that. So the core sustainability issues that we look at are pretty straightforward. So when I say core sustainability issues, it's the things that we want to find out about when we're asking companies how it's going on sustainability kinds of things, water and energy and those kinds of things. So what I've done is I've taken a look at a whole bunch of different frameworks that are used to encourage companies to report on sustainability related issues. So there's the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which I helped put together, which is the only science-based benchmark for how companies should be performing on all of these things. The Global Reporting Initiative, which is the de facto standard for what companies pay attention to and what they report on publicly. The B Corp lens on all of this stuff. Integrated reporting, the Sustainable Development Goals, some guidance from the finance community, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This group, which talks about industry-specific things that should be paid attention to for companies, and an ISO standard on sustainability. And then there are also some frameworks that are used to rate and rank how sustainable a company is relative to other companies out there. So what I wanted to find out was, what are the common criteria? What are the things that they all seem to be talking about? So I created a huge spreadsheet of all of these things. It's available for free, of course, if you want to access it. It's on my website under Frameworks Overview. And what I did was I took a look at all of the things that these different frameworks ask about, and came up with this list of topics, this list of issues that most of them seem to include in their question set that they are encouraging companies to use to assess themselves. Most of them talk about governance. All of them have something to do with environmental things. So there are these 7 things: materials and goods, and the reusable, recyclable attributes of them and where they get them from, and the attributes of the suppliers. Energy, water, emissions, both greenhouse gas and non-greenhouse gas emissions, waste and encroachment, which gets into biodiversity impacts. So most of them talk about that. And what you see across here are the frameworks that you saw in the previous list. And you see sort of symbolic acknowledgement that some of them talk about these things and some of them talk about them in different ways. So the integrated reporting capitals, you may have heard of this before, but there's an encouragement that companies produce integrated reports, and they should frame how they're doing on 6 capitals: financial capitals, manufactured capital, and intellectual capital, which you can monetize. It's fairly straightforward, but also natural, human, and social capital. So they use capitals language to describe this stuff rather than the language that you see in the left-hand column. SDGs also use different language. They use SDG language terminology to describe these things. What I'm trying to help you understand is that they're talking about the same stuff. They're just using a different vocabulary to refer to it. So we've got environmental things, we've got employee-related or worker-related things, and we've got community-related things. And those are the 3 clusters of issues that are core sustainability issues plus governance. So those are the 18 things that are the core things that we want to understand better as to how companies are doing on them. So if we're going to assess companies on those things in the questionnaire that you're putting together for your use, or the one that I've got, then we need to figure out the extent to which stakeholders are being impacted by the company around these issues. So I'm going to show how these issues map to stakeholders. This is another version of the nested interdependencies that we looked at before, with the environment on the outside, society, and the company or a business. Big arrows show the flows out of the environment into the company, either directly or indirectly through suppliers. The fact that the company does something with those materials and services and impacts or produces and impacts waste or those kinds of things to the environment, sometimes to society as well, and vice versa. Then it produces products which are used by people, users. When they're finished with them, they get rid of them. Hopefully they'll do that in a circular way, a circular economy way, where they are going to become input to other people's processes or the company's own processes. So those arrows are intended to represent the circular economy approach. Pretty basic flows: input, do something with it, output. That's the way it works. As the company does that, it's going to impact its stakeholders. Stakeholders such as the environment. So I'm considering the environment to be a stakeholder in this, maybe a special case stakeholder, but definitely a stakeholder. Society itself, the employees in the company. So what we are doing then is seeing the way in which the company is performing on those impact points. The environmental ones are shown here. On the input side, the environment is going to be impacted as the company extracts these materials and goods and services directly or indirectly from the environment and the energy and water that it's using. And then it's going to be impacting the environment, not only from its operations, but at the end of life of the products, even during the use of the products, and the emissions that are being produced, the waste that's being produced, the encroachment from the company's operations. So that's how the 7 environmental issues are shown on the business model of the company. That's where they happen. Society, we keep track of those 5 things in terms of how the company is impacting society. And notice what these things are. There are the direct impacts. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. It also indirectly impacts society in the way in which it provides taxes and donations to non-governmental organizations which are doing useful things for the community and other stakeholders as well. So the company is providing resources, in some cases raw money, and therefore we are trying to discourage companies from using tax shelters and tax havens to avoid paying taxes, because it gets in the way of their ability to support society that way. Business ethics is a no-brainer. What they lobby for, and companies in some cases spend a fortune on lobbying, we want to make sure they're lobbying for the right things. And the same thing about the companies that they invest in, that those are good companies as well. So those are the ways in which companies can directly or indirectly relate to society or impact society. And then the way in which they impact employees, whether they pay them a living wage at least, health and well-being support, and so on. The usual kinds of things, including human rights kinds of things, which gets into employment terms and the concerns process. Plus, the way in which the overall company is being governed by its board, by its executive team, the way it's being run. Governance is just a fancy word for how you run the company. The policies and the regulations inside the organization that you're using to make sure you're doing the right things in the right way. So it's the oversight of the company. And that's it. Those are the sustainability things that we want to find out about. How is the company doing on these things? So those are the core ESG or sustainability issues that are questionnaires, either the one you folks are putting together or the one I'm putting together or whoever. Directly or indirectly, those are the things we're looking for information about. Any questions? Any surprises? Is this intuitively obvious to you? You will find that some frameworks very, very specifically focus on a subset of these. So some of the frameworks are very focused on greenhouse gases and on energy because of the concern about climate change. So some of them make it look like those are the only issues that we need to worry about. And they are very, very, very important. I'm not in any way trying to minimize them. But what I am trying to show you is that they're not necessarily all treated equally in terms of importance. Some are much more important than others in the eyes of the people who are asking about them, especially if they're investors or governments. But basically, this is the whole spectrum of things that one way or another, companies need to pay attention to. So if we ask a company, how are you doing on sustainability? This might be the way in which they can provide an answer to just indicate the extent to which they are doing well on these 18 things. On the other hand, if you're a government and the government itself is trying to pay attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, the SDGs that were put together by the UN folks, and 193 states and the member states of the United Nations have signed up for them, including Canada. So if a Canadian government or provincial government or a municipal government asks a supplier, to what extent are you contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs? They need to use that language when they answer the question. So the SDGs, just as a quick refresher, are a pretty comprehensive set of attributes or characteristics or a roadmap or a blueprint for the kind of society that we want. When you take a look at that, you say, what's wrong with us? Not much. As Canadians, we probably think we're doing really, really well on these things. But there are pockets in Canada where we're not, definitely not. So There's a need for us to pay attention to all of these things, even though we think of ourselves as being in a so-called developed country. These are relevant to all of us. So what we can do with these, and they're numbered and colored in an interesting way, we can regroup them around the clusters that we looked at before. Some of them have to do with environmental kinds of things: water, energy, responsible consumption and production, which gets into materials and circularity of those materials, climate action, which gets into emissions, life below water, which gets into biodiversity, it gets into encroachment, and life on land, which is also important. So what we end up with are a bunch of things which, which are very environmentally related and are bridgeable or aligned with some of the things that we talked about before. On the social side, we can divide the social ones into two groups. The ones that the company can most directly affect through its employees, who are members of society. So some of these workers are employees. Of course, the amount that you pay them is going to have a lot to do with poverty and hunger and those kinds of things, health and well-being, etc. So those are ones that are very much under their control, and others that they are more indirectly going to contribute to the community goals. So what I've done here is swizzled them around and shown that if we can figure out how the company is doing on the base core ESG issues on these things, we can use those as proxies for the scores on how they're doing on these related ones. So what I'm showing here are the core issues and the SDGs that are associated with those core issues to acknowledge the fact that we're all talking about the same stuff. We use slightly different language to be able to show what those things are. So what I'm trying to do is to break the code and help folks understand that we're talking, all of us, about the same thing. We just use different vocabularies or languages to talk about them. And then there's this other language, which is called capitals: natural capital, human capital, and social capital. And even as the names imply, they're easily mappable to those core ESG issues or sustainability issues. So the natural capital dimensions are both on the input side and the output side. So natural capital spans both of those. Social capital is really straightforward, and human capital, human resources, are really straightforward too. So if we can figure out how we're doing on these things, we can use that as a composite score for how we're doing on human capital. So if we can figure out the scores on the core issues, we can use those scores as proxies for how we're doing on the other issues. You with me so far on this?
Yeah.
The reason I'm spending a little time on this is because there are almost religious wars between these frameworks. I mean, there are people that talk about capitals as if it has nothing to do with sustainability. And there are people that talk about the SDGs as if they have nothing to do with sustainability. I don't know why they do that, unless they're trying to carve out a little piece of the action that's unique to them so they can get funding or whatever, but it's unfortunate because basically we're talking about all of the same things, we just package and label them slightly differently. And from an assessment perspective, if we can use the scores on these core ESG things, these 18 things, as proxies for how they're doing on the others, now we can start to have common metrics, which is even more important. And that's where I'm going with this. Okay, so far?
Yeah.
I have a question. I have a
Yes.
question, Bob.
Yes.
Is Barbara here? Okay. So how do we do the actual data collection? If you're talking about so many different frameworks, you're going to have different ways of data collection, right?
Yes.
And actually mapping that onto these different categories.
Yes.
So that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of, you know, how these frameworks, the people behind them, you know, might disagree with each other, and whether or not they have anything to do with sustainability. I worked in the environmental sector for a couple of years with Sierra Club Canada. And it was very educational because I discovered that the attitude towards finance, just even financing the club itself, was about, if you're in the black, you are not committed enough. So
Wow.
the whole idea of being of generating revenue, of having any money in the black and not the red, there was an ideological slant to it that you simply were not doing enough. And that came not just from our club, but it came from the founders of the original Sierra Club, John Muir. So there's different attitudes towards what sustainability even means in terms of the commitment to the environment, and even being able to operate in the black as an entity. So, you know, there's really basic assumptions behind the divisions, I guess is what I'm saying, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yes, yes. And what you're also acknowledging is there are very different mindsets about the goodness or the badness of doing well on these things.
Absolutely.
So if you're a not-for-profit and you're taking the not-for-profit very, very seriously, if you're making a profit, then it almost implies that you're not fulfilling your mandate of being a not-for-profit kind of organization. What I'm trying to help you understand, though, is that you're going to be having conversations with people who don't share the same mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can communicate them, or at least start the conversation on their wavelength, and then help them as we get into a more trusted relationship with them to see things a different way and earn the right to help them see things a different way, then we can take them in a different direction. But to start the conversation, if you don't connect with them where they are, they're going to dismiss you as being irrelevant. You may not agree with where they are, but you'd better acknowledge the fact that that's a point of view that exists, and it's up to you. It's not them. It's up to you to decide how you're going to connect with them on that wavelength, which you may be uncomfortable with, and help them do more to be successful using a business model that you think is a little suspect. So the trick is to how to do that dance in a way that doesn't jeopardize your values, but helps you become a more effective change agent.
Mm-hmm.
That's the challenge of all of us. I mean, we may throw up at the idea of capitalism being the dominant way the world is being run, but if we're trying to change that from within, we have to acknowledge that the way in which people are assessing their success is okay, and help them see that there are other ways to make that assessment, which include factors such as what you see on this slide that are legitimate in the 21st century, whereas previously they weren't. So it's the legitimacy of these things, the importance of these things, the relevance of these things that we are continuously trying to help others see. But if we crap all over their current mentality and their current business model, it's probably going to be a relatively short conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's where the having different kinds of terminology to describe things. So not even mention the word capital, but try something else.
Yeah, but if you're talking to a chief financial officer who is the steward of financial capital,
Mm-hmm.
and is trying to get money for the organization from capitalistic investors and bankers, capital is the only language you talk, which is why some of these folks that are interested in natural, human, and social capital language feel that that is the only language we should talk when we're talking to people in finance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with that, but that's the approach that they're taking. And there's a group of us in Canada called the Capitals Coalition that is trying to come up with better ways of assessing how much of that capital is being impacted by the company, and legitimize non-monetized ways of keeping track of that. Quantified ways, but not with a dollar sign in front of it. So it's an ongoing challenge. So the value of what I've just gone through with you is to help you understand that there are different ways of describing the same things. And depending on who you're talking to, you may want to use that way or this way or some other way. But now you have a portfolio of vocabularies that you can use to have a conversation with people that are more oriented towards one set of frameworks than another. Okay, so we mapped the issues to the stakeholder impact points. Now let's get to this assessment stuff and talk about how the heck we figure out how they're doing on these things. So the basic toolkit, this is an Excel, it's a free open source Excel spreadsheet. My intent is to have it converted into an online questionnaire, the kind of questionnaire that you folks are using, which I think is brilliant. But I don't have the funding to do that yet. So sometime in the next year that should happen, but not yet. So right now it's an Excel spreadsheet. You can download it from the location that's at the bottom of the screen anytime, as many times as you want. Because it's open source, you can change it, you can reword it, you can take things out, you can put things in. It's a starter set of essential questions on the core issues. And what you'll see underneath this descriptor is it helps you score how the company is doing on core sustainability issues, ESG issues. The nice thing about this, the unique thing about this, is that I've designed it so it's got under 50 questions. It's got 36 questions now. My design point is keep it under 50. I'm on version 6 of it, and so far I've been able to keep it under 50 questions. And it asks about how the company is doing on those 18 core issues that I showed in that colored left-hand column, and the things that I showed on the business model. So it's those kinds of things. Once we get the scores on those, what Excel helps us do is it takes those scores and it shows how you are doing on the associated SDGs. It uses those scores as proxies for related scores on the SDGs and related capitals. So it's pretty straightforward, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. And I call the tool the Rosetta Stone of all of these sustainability assessments. The Rosetta Stone, as you may know, is the stone that helped people understand the hieroglyphics that were being used to as writing in ancient times. And because the stone had the same text in different dialects, it helped people understand how to translate between one and the other. So I'm going to go through a slide version of what the toolkit is all about. If we have time, I can show you what it's like online as well, but you can download it and play with it to your heart's content. I'll just give you a sort of an overview using some PowerPoint slides. So there are a number of different tabs or worksheets within the workbook. It's an Excel workbook. There's an intro, which goes through some of the stuff I just went through with you. There is a company profile, which is where the company describes, who it is, where it is, how much money it's making, ownership, that kind of stuff. And then there's a spreadsheet that is all about how it's doing on ESG. At the top of that spreadsheet, so these are the tabs across the bottom, ESG scores is the main worksheet. At the top is a summary of the scores. It's a summary of the scores on the things that we just talked about, on inputs and outputs, on employees, on communities. It's expressed as percents scores, percents out of 100 on all of those things, 100 being is not doing any harm on those things. Over 100 means it's doing some good on them. And you've got a bar chart representation of them as well. So a pretty straightforward Excel functions that allow you to do that. And these scores are developed in the lower part of the spreadsheet, which looks like this when you first open it up. So I'm not sure whether you folks are familiar with Excel or not. Hopefully you have some experience with it, but there's a really cool feature in Excel which allows you to collapse, group a whole bunch of rows, and then expand them. So it's like an accordion function that you can use in Excel. So what I've got here are a whole bunch of collapsed rows, grouped rows on this Excel worksheet. And the way you open them up is a little plus sign over in the extreme left-hand column. And you click on a little plus sign and the thing opens up into all of the rows that are within that. And when you've finished with those questions, you can click on the little minus sign and it collapses them back down. So it allows you to have an incredibly comprehensive worksheet, but not overwhelm people with the whole thing at the beginning. They can sort of work their way through it one question at a time. So that's what the little plus signs are. And notice that there are scores here. These are the scores that are transcribed into the sheet that I looked at up before. So this is simply a transcription by Excel of the scores that are associated here. All of the pink or light purple cells are calculated automatically by Excel using the formulas that are in those cells. Any yellow fields are ones which you fill in as the user. And when you start off with this, I've got sample data in a lot of the cells to show you how the formulas work. But of course, you would overlay that with your real data. So it's just a sample to give you a sense of how things are calculated. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a sample question, the governance question, a sample environmental question, a sample employee-related question, and a sample community-related questions. And I hope by now you understand that those are the three groupings that we looked at before: environmental, employee, societal ones. Those are the 18 things that we're going to assess. So, governance. Governance is pretty straightforward. There are only 10 questions. And I should reassure you that this is the distillation of about 157 questions that people normally ask about this stuff in a comprehensive way. And I shrank those down to about 37, got them down to 17, and then I got them down to 10. And I do sessions with people who are attending the Directors College, which is how to become a better director, or how to include factors that the 21st century requires you to in your deliberations and oversight as a board. And this is these are the questions that I encourage them to ask themselves as to whether they're doing the right things on sustainability. So it asks about whether or not they've integrated sustainability into the company's purpose, vision, mission, etc. Whether they've got committees that include mandates to take a look at these sustainability related things, and so on. Is executive compensation tied to how well the company is doing on environmental and social things, etc. And they have a chance to indicate whether the company is doing it at all, or a little bit, or totally. And an overall score gives them a chance to self-assess how they're doing on those things. And notice that there's a lot of check marks. It's a very multiple choice type approach here, trying to keep it really, really simple for SMEs. And the math is very straightforward, sorry. So the purple calculations are dead simple, and you just check the boxes, and as you check the boxes, the numbers change at the bottom and the overall score is calculated as well. Okay, so far, you get the drill? So yellow are the things that they check and so on, and all of the purple cells are automatically calculated. Now, there's no weighting in this. I actually generated a version at one point that did have weighting in it, and I thought, different companies may want to weight things differently. So I don't want to turn anybody off by weighting them in a way that they don't think is appropriate. So I don't do any weighting in here, either within the question or between questions. But if they want to, it's just a simple matter of math, so they can do that. So that's it for governance. It's just 10 questions, or one question with 10 choices. Very straightforward. An environmental question, a sample environmental question. This is a one on energy, and all of the environmental ones start off with a description of what this is all about. So there's a bit of a description there. And then there are two parts to this, two questions. One is, how are they doing on managing their energy usage? And how are they doing on helping others improve their management of energy or reducing their need for energy in the first place? So that's the positive stuff. This is reducing their negative impacts. So they have a choice here of, and it's always the same 5 things. We're not currently monitoring or keeping track of this stuff, so they get 0. We do monitor and record our energy usage, and then you're given a chance to put in what that is, like how much energy they're using now, how much of it is renewable energy, and then there's a calculation automatically done between those two numbers. The third part is we've actually set some targets relative to this. The fourth one is we've not only set them, but we've met them for this reporting period. So we've met the targets for this reporting period. And then the last one is whether or not they actually have set an efficiency goal to use 100% low impact renewable energy regardless of the company growth. That's the science, that's where they need to get to. So there's an opportunity for them to be scored on all of these things. They've got 3 check marks here, so they get 75%. They would have gotten 0 if they'd checked the first one. If they checked the last one, they would have gotten 100%. So again, purple cells automatically calculated. And then there's a progress enabler. And this gives them a chance to say, you know what? We're producing products and services that help others save energy. We've got probably the most energy efficient versions of these products on the market, or other kinds of ways in which they are contributing to helping companies reduce the amount of energy they use, or needing energy in the first place. So they just simply check that. And then there's a question that basically says, oh yeah, how much? Like, you got 1 or 2 products, or is this your whole product line? So what % of your revenue is coming from those kinds of products? Or notice that it says our product, services, or donations. So are you supporting NGOs that help organizations do this? So you're given a chance to assess how much you are giving to those in terms of the equivalent revenue that you are generating. And then this 3% is a bonus. So the score is made up of the 2% plus the 75% divided by 2 plus the 3% as a bonus. And that's how the score is done for the environmental one. Any questions on that? So someone was asking about data points before. There are 2 data points. How much energy are you using? And how much of that is renewable energy? 2 data points for this one. In the entire spreadsheet, I think there are 42 data points. It's under 50 data points that are asked for. So it's very explicit, and I try to keep it really, really simple. On the other hand, how they calculate that, how they estimate that, they're encouraged to keep track of how they did that, so that they can go back and improve their data collection, as well as if anybody wanted to audit their answers, they would understand the sources of their data and the assumptions behind their calculations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's energy. An employee type question is really the extent to which they are doing the right things. So a bunch of topics here that you would normally have associated with employment terms. And the more they check off, the higher their score. they check off all of them, they get 100%. So that's a little bit easier. There aren't any data, I don't think there are any data points in any of the employee ones. It's just yes or no type things. So I'm trying to keep it simple, for people that are not necessarily sustainability professionals. And on the community side, there are quite a number of questions on this, but these are two of them. The management of their community concerns process, like how they listen to citizens about any concerns they might have about the operation of the company or its products. And then the progress enabler, how they're helping more people be healthy and safe from harm, as well as employing people with barriers to employment and those kinds of things as well. So a number of things. And again, it's all check mark, check mark, check mark. And the score is a combination of this plus these bonus ones. So that's how the scores are done. Questions?
I have one.
Yes, thank you.
In terms of who actually completes this within a company, it looks like several different departments, or who would be the, the coordinator for this?
That's a good point. And it's a typical point that anybody who's responsible for a sustainability report goes through on an annual basis, because very often it's a special effort to try to gather this data. The good news is that you normally can't do it with just one person. It requires you to connect with a bunch of folks. And the granddaddy of all of these reports would be a B Corp business impact assessment. And many B Corps use that as a catalyst for team building, where they have a team of employees that go out and get all of the answers together and get a much deeper appreciation for the track record of the company on things that they care about. So it can be used as a team building effort as opposed to a big grunt exercise.
Right.
So yeah, the good news is that it does require various members of the organization to contribute answers to these things.
Okay.
If it's a very small enterprise, like a mom and pop shop or a sole proprietor, the way I am, of course, it's pretty straightforward. But I have used this to self-assess how I'm doing it, and I've put out an annual report, integrated report on my website, which shows how I'm doing on all of these things, both in terms of the normal sustainability approaches and scores, as well as how I'm doing on the SDGs and the capitals. So it's very doable. Very doable.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So like you have to calculate ESG scores and capital scores and SDG scores. So is there a kind of need for providing all these scores by a corporation, or just one of them? And
no, actually, if the company doesn't care about capitals, or you don't care about capitals, or nobody cares about capitals, drop the spreadsheet, just delete it. If the company doesn't care about the SDGs, delete it. You don't need it. But if the company does care about the SDGs, or if someone says to the company, to what extent are you contributing to the SDGs? Because we care about them. Do you care about them? Then they need that sheet to explain it. So let me just show you how that works. Remember before I showed that you can align these factors with the SDGs like this? So what the spreadsheet does is it takes all of the answers from the ESG scores sheet, just copies them in. So this is the magic of Excel. Notice that these are all pink or light purple. You don't have to fill these in. They're automatically filled in by Excel as a byproduct of your completion of the ESG scores worksheet. But what this does is it says, governance applies to all of these. So this is a reinforcement for the fact that governance drives everything that you pay attention to. So if you want to improve your scores on all of them, improve your scores at least on governance and the associated ones underneath. So if you take a look at this corner up here, I can't zero in on it a little bit more, but What these two green ones are energy and greenhouse gas emissions. These are the scores that are transcribed by Excel from the previous worksheet. And what it does is it simply echoes those in the two columns that are occupied by the energy and the climate change SDGs. And it shows that those two scores apply to both of them. So the score on those two SDGs, number 7 and number 13, the energy one and the climate change one, are the total of those three divided by 3. So you add those three up, divide by 3, and you end up with a score of 54% is your performance out of 100 on that SDG. And the same thing for climate change as well. So those are called the priority SDGs that these are associated with.
So when we are talking about these scores to an SME, so like, do we have a preference which one we should talk about, or is there a more popular one, like, which one we should basically?
Yeah, I wouldn't talk about SDGs. I wouldn't even talk about capitals unless they are kind of oriented that way. I'd talk about the ESG stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that I got SDGs in there, let me just back up a little bit here. Why did I do this in the first place? I am trying to get the federal government of Canada to ask anybody that wants to be a supplier to the federal government of Canada, and they buy about $23 billion worth of products a year. So they're a big buyer, a big customer. I'm trying to get them to ask anybody that wants to be a supplier to them to please tell them, to disclose to the government how they're doing on contributing to the SDGs. Why? Because the federal government of Canada is committed to the SDGs, and therefore they probably want to deal with companies that are on the same wavelength, that are helping them achieve those SDGs, because they can't do it by themselves. So this is to help companies answer that kind of question. If the federal government says to a supplier, would you please just disclose how you're doing on the SDGs as a pre-qualifier to them being a supplier, this helps that supplier answer the question.
So do these SMEs get kind of training on these scores, how to calculate them or something, like, I mean, you're promoting it, so not everyone knows about it.
They may, for your information, you may know this already, but there's a whole part of the federal government of Canada, which is called Public Services and Procurement Canada, PSPC. And they have within it an Office of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, OSME, OSME, Office of Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises, and they help small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada deal with the government. They send them tenders for products and services that they know these companies are in the business of making and providing. So they try to help companies in Canada deal with the government. And one of the things that we're looking for them to do is to help SMEs complete this survey. But to be very straight with you, my design point for this is that they shouldn't need any help, that it should be self-explanatory. And when it's put online, you can put a lot of other features in here, suggestions on how they could improve their score, guidance on how to do the calculations, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's where we're trying to go with this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So that's the SDG one. And you remember, let's suppose someone wanted the capitals version of this. Well, as you saw before, the capitals are aligned with the same things that we've already scored in the SDG score sheet. So the way in which you do those calculations is pretty straightforward. All of these, and again, it's all light purple because these are automatically populated by Excel as you fill in the worksheet associated with the ESGs. So this simply maps the capitals to the clusters of ESG related issues or sustainability related issues. You come up with a score on the capitals. So if you want to know whether the company is adding or subtracting value from these capitals, compare how they're doing this year with how they did last year, and then you can see whether they're going in the right direction or not. You never actually have to figure out the actual value of the capital. You can just see the relative amount of impact that you're having on the capital. Saves you the trouble of ever figuring out exactly how much it is in the first place. It's like figuring out the water level in your basement rather than how much water is in your basement. Just figure out the level of the water and whether it's going up or down. You don't care how much water there is, you just care about the level. So that's the magic of this. There's a flyer you can download from the website as well, which shows how all of this works. This is the governance set of questions. You figure out how companies are doing on this, including the positive things that they're doing, relate those to scores for the SDGs, and the same scores relate to the capitals. So it's just a different graphical way of showing what those things are. Any questions on any of that? You think it's too hard?
And thank you so much for explaining all of these scores.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to ask an SME to fill this out?
Bob, I had a couple of thoughts on that actually. Well, questions really.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I look at some standards that I have to work with, I'll see things like, you know, either do all these things, or if you've already done this particular credit in this other standard, then you've already met the requirements, just provide documentation and that's good enough. So like underneath each of your questions there where they check yes or no, or yes, partially no, have you considered adding stuff like, you know, if you've done this requirement in this other standard, then you've met it, check yes. Something like that, just to make it easier for them to get through it faster.
Yeah, it's a good thought. And you're quite right. There are certifications out there that allow companies to reassure others that they're doing the right things in a particular area. Many of the certifications have to do with the products more than the company. But there are some certifications at the company level, one of which is a B Corp. So if they're a certified B Corp, from my humble perspective, they don't need to fill this out. They've already got scores on each of these clusters that are a wonderful reflection of how they're doing on these things. And that's a very, very comprehensive questionnaire. The Business Impact Assessment Questionnaire for B Corps is very, very complete. There's also something which the B Lab folks put together, which is called the SDG Assessment Manager. And the SDG Assessment Manager is intended to give the company a chance to score itself on these without overtly scoring itself on these. It's a pretty good questionnaire. The difficulty is the number of questions. There are over 400 questions in the SDG Action Manager. It was designed for small and medium-sized enterprises, and I was really, really hopeful that I would not need to create this because it was going to be created by them. But when I took a look at it, I thought, geez, that's a lot of questions. And their assumption is that you wouldn't fill in all of those because you would only zero in on the SDGs that are material to you, important to you. And I'm thinking, oh, really? You don't want them to assess on how they're doing on all of them, just some of them that they, for whatever reason, think are the important ones? So I was uneasy that it allowed a company to cherry pick the ones that it thought it was either doing really well on or were most material to it, and ignore all of the others. And I think the trust level is low enough in the business community that we need them to assess on all of them, just so that we don't think they're leaving out the bad ones. But if they were to do that using the SDG Action Manager, it would be over 400 questions. So that's why my design point is under 50. I just thought 400 is too many. But you know, you may find that 36 is too many, or whatever. In an online format, it's a little bit more manageable. The version that you're using for your assessment is online, and it's pretty slick. And you're asking about many of the same things. So you've got more flexibility with an online format to play with this, although Excel's not too bad either. It would be nice if we all had a standard and we just said, okay, everybody fills this in. We're not there yet. I think this is as close as I've been able to come to something like that. But you know, there may be better ways. There's an advanced version, by the way, for large corporations that is basically the same, but it asks tougher questions, more questions, allows for the fact they've got multiple locations in multiple countries and a lot more products. So it's significantly more complicated. It's based on the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which is outstanding, but it probably beyond the capability of most SMEs to complete. So this is the essence of that. By the way, I did not make up from scratch any of the questions. All of the questions are based on either questions from the SDG Action Manager or the Future Fit Business Benchmark. And there's an appendix in this that shows those sources for each of the questions. So it says this question is based on whatever it's based on in the SDG Action Manager and the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which are the two best assessments on the planet. Okay, so let's suppose you wanted to then have a dashboard so that you can see all of this stuff and make some decisions, some business decisions on how things are going. What might those dashboards look like? Dashboard has a bit of an action kind of connotation to it, which is why I'm calling them action dashboards. So you're looking at the dials and saying, oh, this one's a little low or this one's a little high or whatever, but it gives you a chance to see which ones you might want to zero in on and do something about. So there are ways that you can structure these dashboards depending on who's going to be looking at it. So if it's customers, employees, communities, and NGOs, you might use the ESG scores. If it's governments that are using the Sustainable Development Goals, you might use the SDG version. If it's investors and lenders, you might use the capitals version. So you might have something that looks like this as a dashboard with a summary for each of the clusters, which is the basic ESG stuff. You might have one like this, which is for the SDGs. You might have one like this, which is for the capitals. So you know, you can be much more creative than these rudimentary graphics here, but what I'm trying to help you understand is that sometimes that kind of a portrayal of the summary of how the company is doing might be a useful thing to consider as well. So they're action dashboards. So we've looked at this previously, we'll look at that next, and we looked at this today. That's kind of a step back and say what we've talked about. So when you get the company excited about what the possibilities might be, then you might want to see how they're doing already on these environmental and social things, and then decide which projects you might want to undertake and how to cost justify them, which is the Sustainability Return on Investment or ROI workbook, which we'll be talking about in the next session, which is not today, it's some other time, the next session.
Yeah, next week.
Questions?
So Bob, when you were talking about manufactured capital, what is it all about?
Oh yeah, that's just fancy language for what a company would normally show on its balance sheet. So the value of its buildings, which are manufactured in a sense, the value of its equipment, which is manufactured. So it's things that are tangible assets that the company has that are usually buildings and equipment. Okay. Or vehicles if they own trucks and those kinds of things. That's all so-called manufactured capital. And the reason that that's important to a company is it's important to show how healthy their balance sheet is when they're talking to investors.
Okay, thank you.
Intellectual capital and relationship capital, or intellectual capital is a little bit fuzzier. You can think of it as the value of their patents and their copyrights. It's actually more than that, but the easiest way of attaching a dollar sign in front of it, the way you do with financial and manufactured capital, is to think of it as the value of their intellectual capital, such as copyrights and patents.
Bob, thanks for the information provided. I have one question. How can small and medium companies use their contribution to the SDGs? Because they're gonna have a kind of metric with their contribution, but how they can use this information with their stakeholders?
So let me reinforce that it's called a 3-in-1 sustainability assessment toolkit, so that it shows you how to do the assessment in these 3 different ways if you need to.
Okay.
90% of the companies out there will not need to, especially on the SDGs. But if a government is asking the question and the government is committed to meeting the SDGs, then they would like the answer probably expressed as to how the company that they are asking the question to is contributing to the SDGs. This is how they would answer it. But if they're not being asked, there's no reason why they should even be able to spell SDG.
Okay, thank you.
Or if a banker says, how are you doing on your impacts on natural, human, and social capital? Or an investor wants to know how they're doing on those things, then they can use that spreadsheet to provide the answer. But if they don't ask them about that stuff, then you can answer it using the ESG one. So they want to know, how are you doing on climate change? Just zero in on those climate change related questions, energy and greenhouse gases, and provide the scores on those.
Do you think this context of the pandemic is gonna improve this this requirement to small and medium companies?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'd like to believe that they will be encouraged to pay more attention to these things, because companies that pay attention to these things can survive these downturns caused by the pandemic and other crises better than others. So there's significant evidence that the value of publicly traded companies that are really into sustainability has not dropped as much on the stock market as the value of other companies. And in fact, they're doing better. So they're going to be more resilient if they're doing the right things for their people and for their community and for their customers and for the environment. And they're going to be more resilient. We need more companies to be sustainable so that when the next crisis hits, they'll be better prepared for it. And that's why the questions that your questionnaire have at the beginning about the financial reserves that they have at their disposal are really good questions. I don't ask those things in this one, but there are some questions at the beginning of the assessment questionnaire that Fabian put together, which have a lot to do with the reserves that the company has protected so that it can ride out these problems of reduced revenue when their expenses are not going down, but their revenue is dropped like a stone. So do they have, the ability to survive for 6 months, a year? So those are good questions.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay. Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
For some reason, it won't allow me to stop sharing my screen. Are you still able to hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. because it's just grayed out my entire screen for some reason. So I apologize. I was trying to bring us back to being able to see everybody, but it's not letting me do that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Any other questions?
Well, just to tell you that this spreadsheet that you done, it's so important, I think, and the way that we can present information with it and how it gathers the different, let's say, vocabulary or point of views, I think it's really useful for us. And yeah, so I just wanted to thank you for first doing it, second, sharing it with us, and third, for doing it on open source.
Oh, you're very welcome. And it really, when I say open source, I really do encourage you to massage the questions and tailor them to your situation and treat it as your own. Treat it as a base on which you can build, so that it is zeroing in on the things that you think it should. I just changed questions this morning, especially around greenhouse gases. And produced version 6 of it, which is the one that you would download this afternoon if you were to do that. Greenhouse gases, by the way, are a real challenge to calculate, because as you probably know, there are 3 different classifications of greenhouse gases. Scope 1, which are the ones that come from the company's own operations. Scope 2, that come from whatever power plant is providing it with electricity. And scope 3, which is all the rest, which are the emissions coming from its supply chain, from the transportation of goods from the supplier to the company, from the transportation of the company to its distribution and customers, from employee travel, from employee commute. There are 15 different categories of scope 3, and it's a challenge for companies to figure all of that stuff out. So I tried to make it a little bit more straightforward this morning, simplify it a bit. But the level of detail in those calculations can be pretty intense. And there's good guidance from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on how to do that, but I think it's beyond the ability of most SMEs to invest time in. So I've tried to be fair on that.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?